So thanks, Liz. Thanks for having me here. It's a pretty cool environment. I'm really happy to be here and to be talking to a small, really concentrated group like this. And also, I think this is going to be a fun topic to talk about. So basically what I'm going to be getting at is this book that I came across in maybe 2004, and it's by Christopher Alexander. It's called Notes on the Synthesis of Form, which is a little bit of an imposing title. It sounds kind of complicated. And it's one of these things that we see listed a lot. There's a new book that just came out by, what is the guy? The guy who wrote the Mythical Man Month, called The Design of Design. And he's saying that this is one of the books that really influenced him. And over again, we see this book mentioned, but so few people are talking about it, talking about how it actually applies to their work. So that's what I want to do tonight. And Christopher Alexander is actually quite well known. Mostly, if you hear his name, you think of this book called Pattern Language. Can I get a hand? Anybody who recognizes that book or has heard about this? Okay, quite a few, yeah. So the work that Christopher Alexander did in this first book is like the foundation of pattern language. In order to actually understand what a pattern is and the core ideas of that book, we actually start here. And then what we'll talk about also is how these ideas can become a sort of basis for two other books that I would recommend of his, the first two books of his Nature of Order series, The Phenomenon of Life and Process of Creating Life. They're book 1 and 2, and those both have some really interesting stuff in them. But today the focus is on this Notes on the Synthesis of Form. And basically, the key idea in this book is, well, it's taken some time for me to decide, like, what can I summarize in this thing? Because Alexander is amazing how he can pack so many ideas in. He has this very kind of precise way of writing, and he's got a brain like this. So, but if I had to summarize it, the key idea is that he's showing us a different way of approaching a design problem. And the reason that this is so interesting to me is because when I've looked out in the world at other designers and designers that I admire, there's definitely a difference between some people are consistently producing really good designs, consistently producing really thoughtful, good solutions, and others are not. And then it's like, well, what is the difference between the two camps, right? Like, what are the people who consistently do good work doing that makes them different? And I think some of the ideas in here point to that. And basically, if we're looking into any kind of theory about design or any kind of guide that's going to help us do design, there's two things that we would really like to get out of that. One thing we would like to know is, how do we even start designing? Because we can make anything, and how do we make something good? It's just the simplest idea, right? How do we actually start from not having anything and then actually bring these together into some kind of design that really makes sense? And then the other thing that we want to do is not only design from scratch, but have some kind of way of looking at the designs that we already have and critiquing them and seeing what's right and what's wrong about them, that isn't just based on what's popular or, does this fit the current fad or is this fit the current trend, but is this actually a really good design that's working for the people who are using it? And then the other thing that's really important for me that I think we should get out of any design theory is that it should help us whenever we, as designers, we're creating user interface, we're creating a piece of software, we're creating something, we need to be able to point to any element in our design and say, why is that there? Why does it work? What were the different pressures that led us to that? And why is it continuing? Instead of saying, well, it kind of looked good, or I started with a box and it's what I could fit in the side, or, as you guys all know the situation, right? We start designing something and we kind of don't know what we're doing. We just keep putting stuff in until it sort of feels right. And then we say, okay, well, it seems I managed it. It's over. Let's do something else. But instead, we want to be able to look at each element in our design and say, why is it working? So Alexander has kind of these two key, these are the only real definitions that we bring into the game here, is he likes to say that when we go into working on a design, we're dividing the world into a form and a context. And this is a really simple idea. So if we're going to design a kettle for boiling water, then we kind of draw this imaginary line around the kettle and say, this is, out of everything in the world, this is the part of the world that I'm putting my attention on right now. This is the thing that I'm going to control. And then everything outside of that is some kind of context, is putting some kind of pressure, or it's putting some kind of constraints on this thing. So this is a simple example of how if we're designing a kettle, then the form is the kettle and the context is the life situation around the kettle. The fact that the kettle goes on top of a stove and the heat comes up in the form of a flame underneath. And the fact that a human being wants this kettle because they want to boil water and then they want to be able to pick it up and tilt it, right? And in order to pick it up, it can't be, the contents of the kettle need to be hot, but the handle can't be too hot because then you'll burn your hand. So there are these different kind of forces in the context that motivate the whole reason for the kettle being there. And those are all outside of it. If we look at doing software design, like what we do at 37 Signals, then the form that we're talking about is actually the user interface. So here's the contents of a web browser. And then the context is all of the life situation outside of that. The fact that somebody is using it on a computer that is fast enough to run it or not too slow. The fact that somebody's using it because they want to accomplish something with the software. What kind of internet connection do they have? What kind of habits does that person have? What kind of expectations do they have? There are all these different things that are outside of the actual interface that are influencing it. And then also we can draw this line between form and context inside of an existing interface. So we can decide that for some reason on this interface that there's this form section here for creating a note, and we want to make some changes to this. This is some part where we have some ideas about how to improve it. So this is the form, and then all the rest of the screen that we don't want to manipulate, this is like a context then. This is some kind of giving us constraints, some kind of outside thing that we're going to leave alone that's going to influence the form that we're making. Now the interesting thing that Alexander does is, because so far it's like, okay, so what, right? There's something you're designing and stuff around it, whatever. But Alexander points out that part of when we first attack a design problem, we're actually making a decision about where this form context boundary should be, and we can move that around. So if our definition coming in of our problem is that, oh, I want to make a kettle, I want to be able to boil water, then clearly this is what we're going to do, we're going to make a kettle. But it's also possible for us to change the definition and to say, well, I don't actually want to make a kettle, I want to have hot water in the kitchen. And if the problem then is that I just want to have boiling hot water, there might be a whole different solution. So for example, we could go over to the faucet, and at the edge of the faucet we could have some kind of attachment that pressurizes the water and boils it as the water passes through. You know, like what we see in these like instant espresso pod machines. So instead of having a kettle, then the form that we would be working on is actually some kind of attachment at the end of a faucet. And we'd be getting the same kind of result, but with a totally different design problem with different constraints. And we've seen something similar happen recently at 37 Signals. We were working on, well, we redesigned the sign-up screen. And the sign-up screen, this is for Highrise. There are a few different plans here. And each plan has these like different possibilities. You know, you can have a certain number of users, you can have a certain number of storage, you can have some number of deals, contacts, things like that. And in the past, Highrise had this feature. Well, it has a feature called Cases, and in Highrise you can have notes about all kinds of different people. And Cases is a feature that allows you to say all of these notes about these 5 different people have to do with the same topic. They all have to do with this lawsuit or this lead that we're trying to make, the sales lead that we have. And it's a kind of a way for you to collect notes together. And we have this limitation in Highrise that certain plans can only have 5 cases, or they can only have 10 cases. And it was always the case before we did this redesign that it would say up to 6 users, 5 gigs of storage, 10 deals, and 5 cases. Then we redesigned the screen, and I don't know if we forgot to include cases again, or if, I don't know what happened, but cases didn't make it onto the chart, but the limit was still inside of the software. So what would happen is people would sign up, they would discover the cases feature, think, oh, this is great, start making cases, start creating putting all kinds of information into their account, and then when they try to create the 6th case, Highrise says to them, you know, sorry, you've used your limit that you didn't know you had. And then people would write support and say, you guys suck, why did you put this limit and not tell me about it? And so we had a design problem, which is, oh, we forgot to show the cases limit on our sign-up form, and now people are angry. So if we just kind of roll with that without pausing to think about it, then we could go in here and say, okay, well, we have to add another line. But when we came back to this screen, we didn't want to add another line, because it's like we're at the border of having too much information here already. Like if you glance at this, this is kind of a lot of information to look at. And if we add one more line, we felt like it was going to put us over the edge of like too much stuff, making the decision too complicated. So we don't want to actually change this form. What we decided is that, well, instead of changing the sign-up screen, we could just change the limit. So what we did is we actually killed the case limit. And now we don't have to change our sign-up form. And the customers who were hitting this wall, they don't hit that wall anymore because the limit doesn't exist. So the customers are happy and the form is happy. But what this is illustrating is how what we did is we, instead of saying that the form that we're going to design is the sign-up screen and the context is all the things that the sign-up screen is trying to do, we rethought the problem and said, oh, the form that we're going to change is the pricing model for the application. And then all the different influencing factors on the pricing model are like all these different business decisions. Those are the context. And in this case, it made sense. So that's form and context and the boundary between the two. Now, Alexander has a really interesting way of defining context. It's not just some fuzzy notion of some kind of environment or something that's around the form or some kind of influencing factor. But what Alexander says is that when we're looking at when we're looking at designing a form, we want to know what are the actual facts in the world that have to do with this form. What are the actual factors in real life that are outside, that are happening already, that are influencing the thing that we're going to design? And he calls these things forces. And Alexander can be pretty poetic, and one of the ways that he kind of illustrates this idea is that if we look at these kind of beautiful sand dunes where you have these regular alternating ripples of sand, that this is actually a form, and these rippling sand dunes are a form that's produced by the force of wind. And it's the interaction of the force of wind and the piles of sand that produce this kind of rippling pattern. And this is an example for Alexander of how when a form and a context are like perfectly fitting, right? That you get a kind of form that perfectly shows both. And then he also uses the example of the water, like the milk drop. How the fact that we actually have this form is this form is showing all of the different forces that are around it. It's showing the fact that there's gravity that's pushing the liquid down, and that there's different kinds of densities between the liquid and the air, right? So that the liquid stays together and the air stays together, and the drop comes in, and then there's surface tension, and there are different kinds of electric charge between the particles, and all of these things are influencing the shape of the splash. And the splash it comes from actually, Alexander was inspired by this guy, I think Darcy Wentworth. He wrote a book called On Growth and Form in the early 1900s. And he's talking about how forms are actually showing us, they're like a perfect picture of all of the forces that are outside of them. And this is kind of Alexander's ideal mental image of what we're doing when we design. So when we design a piece of software, if we design an industrial object, what we're trying to do is make something that is such a perfect response to all of the different life situations and forces outside of it that it's the only thing that could happen. You know, it just fits perfectly with those forces. So with this sort of like vision in mind about what Alexander's going for, we can look a little bit more practically at the process that he outlines. And what he talks about is, first, the thing that we do is we decide where it is that we're going to set the problem, right? So in the case of the kettle, is it we're boiling water with a kettle, or are we going to boil water with a kind of faucet attachment? Or in the case of high-rise, are we going to change the sign-up form, or are we going to just change the pricing model, right? So first we decide this is the place where the world is going to change, and then this is the place all around where the world is going to stay the same. Then after that, having identified that boundary, then we can look at all the different forces that impinge on that place that we're going to change. And we're going to see exactly how we do that. Then having identified those, what we do is we create a kind of sketch or a kind of diagram which is showing a way that all of these different forces coming together can be resolved, can be balanced, can work together so that there's no friction and there's no conflict. So this is the design process that Alexander talks about. So in order to see this in a way that's not abstract, let's look at an example. So the example is going to come from Highrise. Maybe you guys don't know what Highrise is. Highrise is a product of 37 Signals, and it's a web-based software app. And basically the reason that we've made it is we found ourselves in this situation where we had a lot of relationships with people, with business contacts, with professional contacts, and networking and things like that. And all of these people, we have, somebody calls on the phone and you can't quite remember when it was that you talked to them the last time. You can't remember what exactly it was you talked about. You have an ongoing issue with the lawyer or with the landlord, and you're trying to work something out. And every time you talk to him, you can't quite remember what it is that he promised the last week, right? Or you're trying to get a contract settled, and you wish that you had a clear record of all the interactions you had with a person. But instead, you have a little note scrabbled here, and you have an email over there, and then your memory of a phone call that happened with somebody else. And the other thing that we noticed, in addition to having all these relationships and not being able to remember what was happening with them, was that we can never remember to follow up with anybody. You meet somebody and then you think, oh, great, and then you want to give them a call a week later, or you hear about something and you want to send an email to check up on it. But we had no system to keep track of all these different things and all these relationships, so it just kind of didn't happen. So what we did is we built a tool that would allow us to kind of centralize the people that we're working with, kind of centralize the context that we have, and then keep track of histories, notes of interactions with everybody, and also set tasks so that we get reminded, get a little SMS on our phone, don't forget that you have to call so-and-so back about this thing that you talked about last week. So that was kind of where that came from. And if we look at this in terms of Alexander's model, then starting from the beginning, the form that we want to design is this piece of software called Highrise. And in particular, the way that we work at 37 Signals, the thing we wanted to design is the user interface. Because if we have the user interface, then the actual software implementation kind of falls out of that. It's really the user interface that we're starting with. And then the context is like this life situation that we're in that I just described, how we have all of these people in our lives and we can't quite keep track of them and stay on top of all the relationships and be as prepared as we would like to be in dealing with all those people. So here's that definition, right? That we want to create a UI for this app called Highrise, and the context in general is this sort of fuzzy life situation. So now what Alexander says is, instead of taking this fuzzy life situation and then just starting to design, instead we want to look closer at that life situation. Usually when we start a design project, we have this idea of like requirements, right? You guys know what I'm talking about? How you start a project and you're like, okay, well, what does it have to have? And you kind of make this list. But when we make a list of requirements, we're actually just designing without even doing any thought before we're designing, because we're saying this is what it's going to be. And Alexander is saying something completely different. He says, instead of making requirements about the form that you're designing, instead, we should be defining the requirements in the world, so that we should be looking at what are the real facts on the ground that influence what we're trying to do, instead of just making up a list of things to check off for ourselves. And this is how we do that, is we take this context that used to be one fuzzy idea, and we break it apart into all kind of individual facts about the world that bear on the thing that we're trying to make. And so in the case of Highrise, some of the things that I mentioned before, that it's too hard to remember to follow up with people I meet, so I don't do it enough. Or I can't remember how long it's been since I checked in with a certain person. Or I wish I could remember exactly what I talked about with my clients. But these things that we want to do aren't the only facts on the ground that bear on this project. There's also the fact that I want to keep track of all this stuff, but I hate doing data entry. Like this is a major factor. The fact that installing software sucks. Like I don't want to install software. I don't want to have to do that. So there are all kinds of different factors here, and this is an exact picture not only of what Alexander's talking about in the book, but this is the thing that really drew me to the book, because I found that when I was doing design projects, this is exactly what was happening in my head, that I was thinking, okay, what are all the different factors? What are all the things that are happening that this design has to accommodate? And they're all facts, they're not requirements, they're facts about the world that bear on the thing that we're making. So we start with this big collection of of facts, right? And Alexander calls them forces because he thinks of them just like that wind that's creating the form of the sand dunes, or the environmental physical factors that are creating the milk drop. We don't just have this big collection, but actually some of these things naturally clump together. They have to do with each other. And they clump together into groups. So we have some of these are related, and some of them are related over here, and some of them are disconnected from each other. And just by looking at that, we can start to see some patterns. So we can pull a few of these out. So for example, the fact that I worry about forgetting details from a conversation. I wish I could remember exactly what we talked about with clients. I hate doing data entry, so even though I want to remember those things, I don't want to put it anywhere. And I can't remember how long it's been since I've checked in with a certain person. These different concerns kind of have to do with each other. So then if we sit on that, we can design something that fixes this, that takes these different factors into account. And the way we start is with a simple paper sketch. Really, really simple. So not a wireframe, not even an HTML prototype or anything like that, but just a simple sketch that balances these forces out. So here's an example of a sketch to handle this situation. We care about when things happened and we want a history of things that happened. So a pretty natural form for that is a kind of chronology. And then we can have a note for each interaction that happened with a person. Here they called to ask about how the project was going. Here I sent them an update and told my teammate that the client is wanting some more changes. And then here we delivered some changes. Having timestamps for each thing so that I can see when is the last time that we talked. Should I be following up again? And then in order to make the data entry really painless, instead of some kind of separate place to go, like create note, and then you click create note and you have what's the title of the note, what's the description of the note, what color pants were you wearing when you wrote the note, all these different attributes that we usually see. Instead we say, oh, but I hate data entry and this is a factor here. So we have a single text area on the top. And if I go into this text area and I just type something, hit enter, then boom, we get a new note on top. This would be a good way to handle these different factors. And we can see how this design actually maps to these different factors, right? The fact that we care about time, the fact that we want it to go quickly, the fact that we want to remember all these details. So having this kind of basic concept in mind, we can flesh it out a bit more. And here's what it looks like when we actually flesh it out. So we're looking at, we call these things streams. We're looking at a stream for a certain person, for Janice Brown. These are all about her. And here's a place where we add the note. And, a little detail, we needed a button, probably. And sketching this, we see, okay, yeah, this is clear. This is a good concept. And then we take the next step into actually building it. This is what it looks like built out in HighRise. And the thing that I want you to notice when you look at this screen is the fact that even though there are a lot of different elements here, here's the header that says the fact that we're on Janice Brown's page. It's not so different from that, right? And you can see also how the hierarchy is playing out around there, right? This is the key factor, and we have some other stuff kind of attached to it, but it's definitely not competing for the hierarchical prominence of that name there. And we see here's that text area that we looked at, and here's the stream. Now the exact form of the stream changed a little bit. We ended up doing timestamps on the top of each entry. We ended up wanting some other details like the note, who wrote this note. And then as we look further into the app, there can be cases where we have some other metadata there. We have some different kind of filters. But despite all these different details, when we look at this screen now, we can see that there's a very specific motivation behind the bones of the thing, right? And that the specific motivation behind its bones came from these insights about the problem, about what's going on in the world and how this needs to be designed in order to really be useful. So we got one little thing designed. And actually that is the first thing that we designed in HighRise. That was pretty much the most obvious parts of the problem. But then we can go back and we can look at all the things that we're trying to do again. And we also had some other observations that, not only is it that I want to remember things, remember conversations and details, but there was also this thing coming up about wanting to somehow follow up with people, or wanting to be reminded, or wanting to remember to do that. And we have a few forces that we identified. The fact that it's hard to keep track of who should follow up on a lead, or that I don't want two people from our team to follow up on the same lead. The one we mentioned earlier, that it's hard to remember to follow up with people. If I do have something that I need to do, if I do have a follow-up in mind, it doesn't really matter that I do it at Thursday at 3:15 p.m. It's more like, I want to remember that tomorrow I should call this person, or next week I should follow up on that document that I'm expecting to get, right? So this is a factor too, that I'm thinking about, I'm coming at this from my life situation, not from a requirement standpoint, wishing that there was some way I could just remember that next week I have to do this, or tomorrow I have to do this. So we can see that these things naturally group together. And then looking at this group, we can start to get some ideas for a form that balances these factors. And here's a simple sketch that shows that. So what we're looking at here is a simple form where we have some kind of way to enter in a value for the body of the task, or what the task is. And we have a pull down here. This is a pull down menu, just trust me. This is a pull down menu for the thing that we had in mind was we could have these kind of time buckets, like today or tomorrow or Thursday, instead of 2 pull downs for hour and minute, and then having a calendar appear and everything when you usually don't need that. And then we also talked about keeping track of who it is that's responsible for doing this follow-up. So we have a pull down here for selecting the user, the high-rise user that is responsible for this, and then a submit button and a way to cancel. And then if we look at this again, we can see that this is reflecting the different forces that we had. The fact that we hate doing data entry is still bearing on this. So this is a really important factor in our design, that there are very, very, very few fields, as few as necessary. And then again, we don't have a title and a description and a this and a that and all this different kind of metadata. We don't have tags on tasks, all this stuff. We just have one little box where you can type in, call her back, right? And then when, and then who should do it. And then here we can see what it looks like if we really think about it and start to flesh it out a little bit. Yeah? And then built out, this is what we have on production right now. And you can see how, again, some other things started to creep in. A category kind of started to creep in. The idea of privacy crept in. But these things weren't here on the first version. Also this link, or set date time. We had the idea that sometimes you actually want to have a reminder to do something at a very specific time. Sometimes you want to say 10 a.m. tomorrow, I've got to call her, because if I don't do it in the morning, then I'm going to get swept up in things, blah, 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 right? So, but when we did the first version of this screen, it was really field, pull down, submit. And then having this basic form laid out in response to the key concerns, then we had this sort of pattern we could follow. Like, oh, we could add another pull down there. If we add one more, it doesn't give us too much clutter. It doesn't take us too far. And, oh yeah, we wanted to have some kind of privacy to make tasks visible to other people on the account. We can manage that here. This doesn't detract too much. But it's not that we started this having a requirement for all of these things and they were all equally important. So it's a case, again, of looking at what are the bones behind the design. And then this is one of the things that Alexander, he mentioned it in the preface of this book, actually. The book was first written in, I think, 61, something like that, in the early 60s. And about half the book is dedicated to this idea of understanding form and context and identifying these forces and then balancing the forces out into diagrams. And the other half of the book is based on this sort of complicated formalism. Like he wants to mathematically define how you can have these forces and how do you decide if they depend on each other or not. How do you have a probability function of whether they're Alexander's actually trained as a mathematician, and he comes at this this was his doctoral thesis, I think, and he wanted to really go whole hog with this formalism. But then he writes in his preface on the updated edition, "I'm sorry for that," he says. But this stuff about independent groups of forces becoming diagrams is totally right still and is really important. So please read this book, he says in the preface, but only worry about the stuff about the forces and the diagrams, the formalism, I'm sorry. So, and you know, the first time I read that book, I was like, yeah, preface, whatever, you know. And I did what a huge chunk of the design community did for 20 years after he published this thing, which is get obsessed with design methodology and formalism. Oh, if I can, you know, write all the forces and then I can plug them into this software and then it'll figure out all the interactions. It'll tell me which ones I need to make diagrams of, and you know what I mean? Like this designer fantasy, this like design engineer nerd fantasy thing that you can do something formal that is going to tell you how to design. And then I came back to the book again recently, maybe a year ago, and I read the preface, and I was like, this guy, aha, okay, you know, he figured some things out. This stuff actually doesn't matter. It was like a relief. And but also what he says about this being the key idea is quite true, which we see when we go to a pattern language. We can mention that a bit later. So, but what we see here are these two sketches now combined. And what's interesting here is that we have like a whole design now. You know what I mean? We're starting to get a more complicated design. And what this design is showing is some kind of screen for a certain person in high-rise. So you go to Janice Brown's page, and you see this history of everything that happened with Janice. And you have the ability to really quickly, if you're on the phone or you just had a meeting or something, enter a new note about Janice, and it goes into the history. But that's not all. Not only do you have the past, you also have this ability to just go over here and really quickly add a task for the future about Janice. And you can say, call her back, follow up with her, check in on this, check in on that. And this is a really functional, this is like a really good combination of features. It's like a really good design that works well together. But the way that we got there wasn't from starting at the top and down and thinking, oh, we will have history and we will have past and future and they will all be together and it'll be nice. Instead, what we did is we started from the bottom up, building little chunks that were relatively, what do you say, like self-contained as far as their interactions go. You know what I mean? Like they have a lot of internal dependencies, but they don't have a lot of external dependencies. So there's a lot of, there's like forces that are working together that we identified actually before. A subset of forces that are working together to motivate this form. And then there's a different set of forces that are working together to motivate this form. And we build it up and then we're able to compose them together. And this is actually what the whole book of pattern language is about. The idea that a lot of these forces that we identify, if we're doing something that people do a lot, let's say instead of designing software, let's say we're building a house, right? Everybody needs to cook food in their house. Everybody needs to sleep in their house and go to the bathroom in their house and, you know, have a place for the kids to play and stuff like that. So what Alexander noticed was that there are certain patterns of forces that are like recurring, that if you try to do this thing, if you try to build a house, you're going to run into these things. So what a pattern language is each pattern is a little family of forces. And it says, here are the different things that you're going to notice. You're going to notice that there's this and there's that, but there's also this and then there's this problem. How do you deal with that? And then he has a little sketch. He said, this is how you deal with it. The kitchen, you need to do this, you need to do that, and then here are the different factors. So make the counter like that. Does that make sense? So this is basically the key idea behind pattern languages. And this includes not only building a house, but also when you hear about somebody doing design patterns for UI or design patterns for software, it's exactly this. And then another bonus that we get is, aside from being able to kind of modularly define these situations, is that after this design is built out, there's a modularity, how do you say it? There's a kind of independence between these two things. So that if we have some idea about how the task feature could be better, you know, if we have some idea that actually it's really important that we schedule things and that we want, let's say we have a new realization that I keep wanting to have some kind of recurring reminder. Let's say I start using Highrise a lot for billing my clients, and I have some manual billing process, yeah? And I want every 30 days to be reminded to do this for a certain client. Now I have a motivation to change the task feature so it has some kind of like recurring thing instead of just following up. I can go into this block and I can make a change to it. I can add a recurring feature, or I can rethink the design of this block, and I don't have to worry about this, right? Because the forces that are motivating this block are quite distinct from these. And if I just look at the ones that affect this block, then I have a kind of confidence and a kind of boundedness to my state of mind as a designer, right? I mean, like as designers, we're always thinking in terms of possibility spaces, right? Like I have this much room of freedom, and what are my options inside this space, right? And what this does is this gives us kind of defined, useful, meaningful possibility spaces to work in so that we don't make a change here and then find out that the thing over here is broken now. And then when we go to fix that, the thing over here is broken, right? Because of interdependencies. So this is really useful. So then in the end of the day, this is what we ended up with on production for Highrise. So this is Janice Brown's page, and you can see her history here. You can see that there's an add a task button. Again, because of this independence, we were able to say, if the task form is displayed all the time, it's like a little too much. You land on the page and there's like all these pull downs here, but if you don't want to add a task, they don't have any relevance to you, right? Only when you want to add a task do these things matter. So we decided that it would be better to just hide that behind a button. And we could do that because of the relative modularity of these two parts. Yeah? So that is a look at using these ideas to get starting from scratch and identifying some forces in the world and then resolving those forces in diagrams and then building those out such that we get to a design. The other thing that I mentioned in the beginning of the talk was that we also want to know how to look at an existing design and judge that in a useful way. And so that's what we're going to look at now. And what Alexander has, this is like the other main idea that he has, which is that if we just have some requirements for our form that we're designing. Yeah, if we have a checklist that says your app has to have this feature, that feature, this feature, this feature, and it has to be red, pink, and blue, then when we check those boxes, we think that we did a good job and we're done. Yeah? But the criteria was all internal. It was like, you know what I mean? It doesn't tell us anything about if we're actually making something that's useful for the world or not. So Alexander takes a different view, and he says, if we want to judge a design, he says we can't actually make requirements. How do you explain that? He has a kind of a long way of explaining it, and I want a short way of explaining it. Basically, if we just say everything that the design should be, right, then our list can be miles and miles and miles long. Because if you look at the screen that we were just looking at, this Highrise screen, right, how many pixels do you think are positioned here? I mean, pretty much you could do 1024 times 768 to tell you how many bits of information are set here. Yeah? It's a big number. I don't know what it is. It's a big number. And if we were to say, like, does this meet the requirements or not, we would have to have a requirement for every single pixel in order to have the answer or not. And this is ridiculous, right? The only way that we can actually have a useful way of deciding if something is good or not is not by seeing if it meets requirements, but actually by looking to see if it collides with reality and produces some kind of misfit or conflict. So Alexander's saying we defined all of these different forces that are out there in the world, right? Like the fact that we want to go into Highrise and we don't like data entry, but we wish that we could keep track of a conversation, right? If Highrise had a really painful data entry process, then I would go into Highrise, want to add a note, and say to myself, I hate this. I don't want to use this, and stop using it, right? And that moment of like discontent or of brokenness or of this isn't right, that moment is actually what we look for in order to judge a design, according to Alexander. He's saying that design is an error-correcting process. And the only way that we can say a design is good is if it just has an absence of misfits, if it just has an absence of friction points. And this is totally consistent with the way that we're working at 37. We're looking at things in terms of how many pain points are here, what's bothering me about it. And then when we can remove those different points, then we feel like we're in a situation that is comfortable, that is without friction, that is effortless, that's easy, that's natural. And then this is what we're going for. So let's see this illustrated. So in HighRise, we have some extra details. There's not only just the note itself, just the body of the note, but we also have this link here below the note. It says show options, files, cases, deals, and permissions. What you can do is, it's a little bit of a junk drawer. This place that we put stuff that we didn't want to put out, right? But it's useful. So if I click that, it expands down, and I get a whole bunch of options. And most of these were mentioned in that little tip at the end of the link, right? Files, set the date, permissions. So here we can attach files to the note. We can attach it to other things in the app. We can set the permissions, who can see the note. We can set the date of when it happened. And then finally, we have a block here. You can email this note such that when you click add, anybody who's checked here will get a little notification email that says, something happened with Janice, Ryan wrote a note about it, here's what it is. Now, in theory, this works really well, right? Because not all the time, you don't always want to notify people of a note. Sometimes you just want to put it in there. Sometimes you do, so we make it an option, right? But in practice, what happens is I get to this screen, and I type my note, and I look at the note and say, does the note say what I want? I kind of proofread it. Yeah, that's good. I hit add, and then the opportunity has passed. Then I realize after I read it, oh, damn it, I wish that Jason knew this. Or I wish that, somebody else, and now my options suck. Now I have to copy and paste the note that I wrote, go to my email client, think of who I want, autocomplete their email addresses, put all the names in, paste it in, and then the information that they get isn't linked in with all the other history, so they don't have the context. You guys get how this isn't working, yeah? So what we have here is some misfit. We have a conflict between the forces, the facts on the ground, and the way that our form is designed. So these are all forces that relate to notification, if we just kind of pull some out of the air. So for many notes, I don't care about updating them. Again, I hate doing data entry. I don't want to check a whole bunch of things. It's too much work to post an update on HighRise and separately email people. And a lot of these are handled by the original design, but 2 of them are not. It turns out that I don't think about notifying others of an update until after I've saved it. And this isn't some kind of a priori logical thing. It's one of these things that you find out. It's a fact about the world that it just turns out like that, right? And we didn't know. And the other thing that we might have known a little bit, had a sneaking suspicion about, is that it's hard to remember stuff that's hidden behind a link. If stuff is hidden inside of a drawer and there's no cue of what's behind this drawer, what's behind this link, then chances are you're going to forget that it even exists. Related to that, we actually have another little note here. If a comma delimited list, so that's referring to, let me show you again, right here. Show options, files, cases, deals, permissions. This is giving us a little tip here that this is what's behind this link. And it's a shorter way of giving you a clue of what all that stuff is without actually showing you all that stuff. Now the problem is that there's a fact that if we put too many things in this comma delimited list, it loses its quality of being scannable. When it's short and it's just a few things, your eye can go here, it can skip past, and it can be like, files, permissions. Yeah? But if the list gets this long, then your eye just says, that's too long, I don't care, and skips over the whole thing. Or maybe you see it can be that you see the first word and the last word, but you don't see the middle contents at all when it's too long. So this is actually a force that affects the form that we designed, that if a comma delimited list has too many members, it becomes unscannable. So for this reason, we wouldn't go in and do an alternative form where we say, show options, files, date, cases, permissions, and notifications, right? So what do? So what we want to do is we want to redesign the form in such a way that these forces aren't in conflict anymore. If we look at that, so here's a quick sketch. Here's that new note text area. Here's the options link. Here's the submit button. When we type in a note and we hit submit, we get a new note that appears at the top of the stream. What we could do is, underneath that note, we could have a little call out. And this call out could be, these little blinking majesty lines are showing that it's like, somehow we're going to draw people's attention to this. And we have some text in here that says, like, you want to notify people? Click here. And then if they click there, we can expand in line where that little notice was. And we can show some kind of form that is like, here's the checkboxes to check off who you want to notify, and click submit, and it'll happen. So let's look at what that would look like. So here we've typed in a note. It was added to the top of the stream. And immediately after it was added, it has a special state. It has a special, just added state. And here it says notify people about this note. And then if I click notify people about this note, it can expand and give me that form right where it is. So this is a better design because this is, instead of working against the facts that I don't think about notifying until after I do it, it's working with them. So now if we look back at the interactions between the forces in the world and the actual form that we have, we can see that these are happy, that these things are working together now, that our form is using these facts and working with people instead of against them. So that's a look at misfits. If we kind of add this on to the original story that we looked at, we have a fourth step. We have drawing a boundary between the part of the world we're going to change and the part we're going to leave alone. We have identifying the forces that bear on the thing we're going to design. We have resolving those forces into diagrams. And then we have the real test of whether we did a good job or not. And we don't know until we do this, which is that we have to build the form, make it real, put it into the actual living context, and then see if anything bashes into each other or not. Actually see if the form fits with the forces that are around it, or if there's some kind of conflict. And the only way to really know is to do it for real. Now, considering the fact that it's expensive to build an entire running application with customers and everything for every design idea you have, we do our best with prototyping, right? To kind of asymptotically approach this ideal. But the important thing is that we're trying to do that, and that we understand that this is the truth, right? That we can only really know if we put it into the living situation and then look for conflict. So that covers pretty much what I wanted to talk about. There are a few takeaways that I want to reinforce here. That the main things we talked about here were forms, context, which is a system of forces around the form, facts on the ground, facts about the world, and fitness, the relationship between these two. This is what we're interested in. And that we want to have a different way of thinking about requirements. We want to forget about this idea that requirements are attributes of the thing that we're creating. Yeah? That it's not that it has to have this and have that and be blue, but that instead, that the requirements, the things that are required, are that what we create plays with the real life situation around it, that it plays with reality. Those are the real requirements, are the facts about the world. Those are the things that you can't change. Designing with forces means knowing why. It means looking at a design and seeing the bones of it, and knowing which parts of the design are built out of interacting forces that matter and that impinge on each other, and which parts don't matter, which parts are separated, why those things are there, what motivated them, what we can change, what we can expand, right? Having that understanding. And that starting with forces allows us to, instead of so often when we do a design, we draw a big box, right? We start with a big canvas, then we say the nav is going to be here, and there's going to be a sidebar here, and we'll have a main column, and what goes in the main column? Well, okay, we'll fill the sidebar with this, and then we'll fill the main column with that. And what we're doing is we're starting from the frame and we're going top down and filling in. What we can do when we start thinking about it in terms of forces and then composing up from the forces is we're going from the inside out. There are some posts that we've written at 37 Signals on our blog about this idea of designing the epicenter. And this is the same idea, which is finding those things that we need to handle with design, building them as small chunks, and then aggregating them into larger wholes. And then a design is good when it fits the world, not when it meets a list of requirements or when it happens to be the fashionable style or meets whatever it is that we were playing around with at the time. It has to fit the world. So with these basic ideas, I talked a little bit about how you can get into pattern language, because now you know what a pattern is. A pattern is a recurring set of forces and a way to resolve them. And then if you're interested in this stuff, there's two books. Alexander has quite a few books, but I think some of them are more valuable than others. And in particular, the first book of Nature of Order is really interesting, and the second book is really interesting. If you were to pick one of these, I would pick the second. It's specifically about the process of design and how we can create things that are like how the process that we use to design leads to either good designs or bad designs. And it's some really good stuff. And the last thing I want to mention to you is a book called Domain-Driven Design. If you're into software, if you create software, including user interfaces, not just programming, but if it's the same thing, this book is fantastic. What Eric Evans is doing is he's using the pattern format. The whole book is a collection of patterns, but what they're about is basing everything that we do off of the so-called domain. Have you guys heard, I don't know how common this is, this word domain used with design? Can I get a hand if anybody has heard this word? Yeah, okay, so a little bit, but the hands aren't very high. They're kind of like... So that's kind of a problem, actually, because a lot of people talk about domains, but they don't really, it's hard to define them. Because loosely, domain means, well, it's like the sort of situation that you're making something for. It's like you're making a shipping app and your domain is like shipping. But what does that mean? You know what I mean? Alexander is actually giving a very clear definition of what a domain is. It's a system of causal interactions that are present in the world that affect the thing that you're making. And Evans takes this idea and he has some awesome, super practical advice about making software and how to work with our clients and working with customers to produce software that is totally fitting with their lives and what they're trying to do and building up on this domain. And taking the two together, Alexander's work about forces and Evans' work about domains is a really powerful, insightful combination if you're doing software. So I just wanted to take the chance to recommend that.